Hi everybody! In this video we'll be talking about how you can cue your reader, or use rhetorical devices to keep your ideas clear, logically connected, and easy to follow. Before we get started, let's review the different kinds of cueing devices. These include the most well-known, including titles and thesis statements, but also paragraphing, transitions within paragraphs and at the beginning and the end, as well as subheadings or topic sentences, things that cue the reader to the different aspects of your argument. While everybody knows what a title is, the other kind of cueing device we hear about are thesis statements, and these are a little bit trickier. A thesis serves as a guide to your essay. Whatever you say in your thesis will be the container that holds everything else you're going to say in your paper. It must relate both the general topic and a specific stance on that topic that you'll argue throughout your essay. In a typical college essay, there are a few standard kinds of thesis statements. When you sit down to write your essays, think about what kind of thesis you'll use before you get started writing, by evaluating the prompt and seeing what your professor is asking for. Doing so before you start writing will make it that much easier. But a few basic kinds of theses include call to action or proposal of a solution thesis statements, evaluative thesis statements, causal thesis statements, and factual thesis statements. Call to action or proposal of a solution thesis statements are used when arguing that someone specific should use something specific. Usually proposing a remedy to an important problem, they often contain words like need to, must, or should. So here's an example from the article How a National Food Policy Could Save Millions of American Lives. This statement says, "Yet we have no food policy, no plan or agreed upon principles for managing American agriculture or the food system as a whole. That must change." So this might look like a little different than a typical college essay thesis statement, but it contains the same components, including the imperative must. Evaluative thesis statements are used when judging the quality of a thing in the context of its genre and/or its success or usefulness. Here's an example from The Farm Bill Drove Me Insane. The bill not only lacked an overarching vision, but seemed designed to obfuscate how the programs actually worked. Here you can see the author, Marion Nestle, is being critical of the Farm Bill. Causal thesis statements are used when arguing that something specific causes or will cause a specified consequence. Notice the repeated use of the word specific. That means that you'll actually want to specify or state the actual thing in your thesis statement. Don't use vague or broad language. Actually state what you're talking about in very clear terms. So here's another example from Marion Nestle from her book Food Politics. She writes, "Pressures from food companies have led government officials and nutrition professionals to produce dietary guidelines that disguise eat less messages with euphemisms." Here you can see some very specific things she's stating. Food companies have led government officials and nutrition professionals to produce dietary guidelines that disguise eat less messages with euphemisms. Again, all of these terms are very specific and defined. And the last kind of thesis statement is factual. This is when you're arguing that a certain condition exists or is true. This might be a condition that people might contest or something that people might say, oh, that's not real, it's not actually happening, it's not actually true. And that way, it's not really a fact, it still is an argument, although you're arguing that it's a fact. An example of this is from Raj Patel's Stuffed and Starved. He writes, "The highest temple of the modern food system is the supermarket." In this way, he's arguing that the most important component of our food system is our supermarkets. One way to tell if a thesis statement is a factual thesis statement is the telltale word is. You could also rephrase this as, "It is true. It is in fact true. The highest temple of a modern food system is the supermarket." So it's not just enough to have a position and a stance. You have to consider a lot of other elements when you're thinking about how to formulate a good thesis. These include things like it has to be arguable, clear, assertive, narrowly focused and qualified, something you can support, and something you care about. It has to be arguable, meaning you must be able to imagine a reasonable person arguing the opposite point of view. There has to be some kind of controversy there, two parts or two sides to the issue. It has to be clear, meaning no one reading your thesis should be able to misinterpret what your main idea is. And it should be assertive. No, I think, or maybe, or I feel that. It shouldn't be wishy-washy. You should just flat out state what you're saying without any qualifications. But when I say without any qualifications, I don't mean that it doesn't have limitations. So your thesis also has to be narrowly focused and qualified insofar as you're only addressing a very limited scope of a possibly much larger discussion. And you qualify it meaning that you acknowledge that in some way this issue is complex. There are a lot of facets to it, and even though you are accurate or you're right, there is a lot more to it than just your side. You might show the flaws or limitations of your proposal of a solution, or you might illustrate the fact that your opposition might have some really good points too, even though you tend to disagree with the bulk of your opposition's argument. It should also be something you can support. So this is a really important aspect of any college essay. If you have a limited set of course materials from which to draw from, or you go to the library and can find no evidence to back up what you want to say, even after very thorough research, or you can't even find evidence directly addressing your topic. Maybe it is a really, really rare topic that you're discussing, and you're really having a hard time finding stuff to write about with it. You might want to consider altering your point of view to reflect your research and evidence possibilities. Now, obviously, if you're not doing a great job with your research, you might not be turning up some good stuff to use. But you also have to keep in mind that in the real world, you may never find the resources to use for some specific thing, or you might be asked to write a paper using a limited body of resources. So keep that in mind when formulating your thesis. And finally, it should be something that you care about. So even if you've never experienced a certain problem, surely you can find something in the world of events and arguments that seems important to you pertaining to your topic. So ask yourself what bothers you. What injustices surrounding your topic do you see? What damage is being done, and to whom, or what is that damage being done to? Who is affected by this? How can you care about that fact? So now that we've learned about the different types of thesis statements and some things that make a thesis good or not so good, let's evaluate a few thesis statements and consider what kind of thesis is it? How could it be possibly improved? And how would you prove it? Or maybe what kind of evidence might you use? Or if you were to encounter that thesis statement, what would you expect would follow after the author stated it? This first thesis statement comes from the article, How Change is Going to Come in the Food System by Michael Pollan. He writes, to date, however, the food movement can claim more success in changing popular consciousness than in shifting, in any fundamental way, the political and economic forces shaping the food system, or, for that matter, in changing the standard American diet, which has only gotten worse since the 1970s. So take a minute to think about this thesis statement. What kind of thesis is it? What's good about it? What's bad about it? And what might you expect to see following this thesis statement? You can pause your video here. Okay, so let's see what kind of thesis statement this is and evaluate it together. So this is actually an evaluative thesis statement, and that's because it's evaluating the efficacy of the food movement in its goal of creating change in our food system and eating habits. And it's finding it to be relatively ineffective. While this thesis statement does use specific language and contains a topic and a stance, it gets a little bit verbose, specifically in the beginning and the end. While that might be fine for an op-ed, If this was a college essay, these aspects could perhaps work better before or after the thesis statement, but not in the thesis statement, to keep the statement itself more concise. Pollan does use a clear qualifying statement, which is right here. The food movement hasn't made any fundamental changes, meaning perhaps there has been some nominal changes, but nothing in any fundamental way. And what would you expect to see follow it? Perhaps a discussion of what the food movement is, specific examples, this is evidence, of how it has changed popular consciousness, as well as evidence that the food system and our diets have been relatively the same from a time before the food movement to now. All right, let's do another one. So here's an excerpt from the article Diabetes Shouldn't Bankrupt You by Elizabeth Rosenthal. That's why, as the United States attempts to rein in its $3 trillion annual medical bill and revamp its healthcare system, any plan must involve a solution for the people with serious chronic illness, like the one developed for kidney failure almost half a century ago. So take a second to look at it. You can pause it right now. All right, so let's take a look at this thesis statement together. So this is actually a call to action or proposal of a solution thesis, and the telltale sign of that is the word must. Any plan must involve a solution for people with chronic illness. Now, for this kind of thesis, you don't have to do both. Implore people to act to fix a problem and propose exactly how to solve the problem. Here in this thesis statement, the focus is more on the action itself and the problem, of course, associated with it. Other thesis statements might detail a more specific solution, but it's the same idea. There's a problem and it needs to be solved, and you, the audience, you're the ones who need to get a move on it. This thesis is pretty straightforward. It's pretty concise compared to the last one, but still, the last little bit feels tacked on. This little bit about kidney failure, it's too specific, and it's not really about the broad topic. It's giving an example. And that would be better off earlier on in the introduction or maybe in a paragraph later. I'd expect the rest of the essay, though, to contain both evidence for the fact that chronic illness is a major problem with our healthcare, and also possibly how addressing chronic illness will in turn address issues with our healthcare system, which is an allusion to a solution. And let's quickly look at just one more from the article, Mao's Great Leap to Famine. The worst catastrophe in China's history, and one of the worst anywhere, was the Great Famine of 1958 to 1962. And to this day, the ruling Communist Party has not fully acknowledged the degree to which it was a direct result of the forcible herding of villagers into communes under the Great Leap Forward that Mao Zedong launched in 1958. So pause quickly and take a look at it. So you're ready to look at it together? Well, here's the answer. This is both a factual and causal thesis statement. The first part is a fact. The worst catastrophe in China's history was the Great Famine of 1958 to 1962. The second part, causal, happens at the end. It was a direct result of these actions by Mao Zedong. Is it a good thesis statement? Well, if the essay is going to cover both of these aspects relatively equally, yeah, it works, even though it's quite long. But if one is going to take precedent over the other, it would be a good idea to focus the thesis on just number 1 or number 2. And of course, what would I expect to see in this essay? I would expect to see proof for the factual statement that it was the worst catastrophe in China's history, as well as proof that it was, in fact, directly caused by these forcible herdings. Evidence for both of those statements, the causal statement and the factual one. So now that we've taken a look at different kinds of thesis statements, in the second part of this video, we'll look at thesis statements' connection to all of those other cueing devices.